Okay, still trying to get used to the Swivl, and it's presenting challenges. Good to be back. Good to see you guys. Um, Let me go ahead. Couple of orders of business type things. I'm going to send around. I know we've been doing this a lot lately. Send around the current version of the sign-in sheet, at least as I have it. If you've changed your mind, if I got down the wrong article for you, just let me know, and we'll fix it. Again, the point is to try to have some structure in place so that you're not scrambling at the last minute to read these articles and put a presentation together. That's the next thing I'm going to be doing over the next few days, is coming up with the actual calendar dates for it. And originally the thought was that, well, it'll be a 10 to 15-minute presentation. You can do it from where you're sitting. It's not meant to induce any kind of public speaking anxiety or anything, though. The sense I get is that most of you folks are pretty comfortable talking. I mean, nobody's nuts for public speaking usually, right? It's kind of stressful. Apparently, it's second on the list after death in terms of most feared things. Death, public speaking. That's what I hear. I don't know if that's really true or not. But in any case, that was my original thought. But in my experience in the past, when I've done 300-level seminars, upper level for majors, and I've had a presentation component, what's often happened is the entire meeting is taken up with just one person's presentation, because you get into it and there's questions, and then there's sort of going through the material, and it doesn't ever go as fast as you might think. So we'll see. Given the number of students that we've got face to face, it looked like the last maybe 8 meetings or so, a person per meeting, to kind of lead the discussion of their paper, and then we'll jump in and have questions and whatnot. And you're supposed to, as part of fulfilling the capstone requirement, do a revision of the presentation, which I wasn't on the committee that came up with these requirements. I didn't have any input. Just between us, I think that's kind of silly for a presentation. I can see rewriting a paper, and you will do a revision of your final paper. You'll give me a rough draft. I'll make comments, and you'll take them into consideration as you see fit. But for the presentation revision, I think what I'm going to do there is have you just make a short 10-minute video and email it to me by the end of the semester. And then that 10-minute version will take into consideration how the in-class version went. So it'd be kind of a cleaned up, pared down version of it. And that should work out, I think, pretty well. But I'll be putting the calendar together for those dates, so you can have that well in advance to plan. And as I said, it's not too soon to take a look at the article you've got your name beside, because several people have said, I looked at it and I don't want to do it anymore. I want to do a different one. And that's fine, as long as there's enough time to do it. Making sure this is still recording. Okay. So that's one thing. What was another thing I wanted to remember to tell you? I put some stuff out on Canvas for us. Yesterday, I put the 4th discussion board is out there. It asked about 2 sort of ways of dealing with the Gettier problem, the no false grounds and the no defeaters approaches, and you can take a look at those questions and get on those as soon as you can, and give us something to talk about for next time, because I don't think we'll get fully there today. There's enough other stuff to talk about. And I've also put the notes that I've been projecting, so the online folks can't easily see the projector screen behind me here at the same time as they're seeing me without a lot of glare. But it'll be out there for you folks as well. And of course you'll have it just so you can take notes on stuff I'm projecting. That's fine. But I've got my actual copies are out there on Canvas I think it's under modules. Also, last time's meeting, the video for that, fingers crossed, Swivl worked, and we've got that out there as well. So, those are primarily there for our online students, but certainly you have access to them as well. If there was some part of the discussion that you weren't sure you were following, or if I said something that was wrong and you want to go back and make sure you heard it right, you can correct me, that's fine. So that's out there as well. The plan for today is to get back into the traditional analysis of knowledge, right? Thinking about that, and to get at least through the Gettier problem and some of what's involved in the Gettier problem. I will say that you should take a look at Gettier's original paper. So the traditional analysis of knowledge that we've been dealing with, TAK, right, as Feldman calls it, So-called justified true belief, or JTB analysis, has been around. I mean, you know, I'm not a historian of philosophy, though I like the history of philosophy. I'm a contemporary philosopher, and so my interest is in an area of expertise is epistemology. And as far as I can tell, the JTB analysis, you can find the seeds of that all the way back in Plato. If you go to, we need to have Dominic here because he's a big Plato fan. He's working on a project on Plato, I think, this semester. You can go back to, you know, Plato's work's divided into 3 periods roughly: early, middle, and late. And you can go back to the late period especially, and there's a dialogue called Theaetetus. Anybody read it? Probably looked at it or something, yeah. And it's a dialogue on knowledge. And it's Plato and a young student named Theaetetus, and they're going back and forth about, you know, what is knowledge and what separates truth and belief from knowledge. Hey, you made it, good. And in that analysis, we're talking about Theaetetus and the sort of, true opinion with an account. And that meant to many historians of philosophy, that's sort of an early version of the what's come to be called the traditional analysis, or the JTB account. And it's certainly up until the 20th century. It's interesting, right? I mean, people always talk about, or not always, but lots of non-philosophers, I think, get kind of frustrated that philosophy doesn't seem to make progress, right? This is kind of a typical argument, sort of a track record argument. Look at science. Look at all the progress we've made in the sciences in just the past 50 years or 100 years. Where's that progress in philosophy at? We don't seem to see it, right? Well, it's a different story, right? In philosophy, it's not science, but I find it kind of interesting and in some ways reassuring that somebody like Ed Gettier can come along in 1963 and in basically 2.5 pages write an article that completely destroys a 2,000-year-old plus tradition in epistemology. I mean, that's incredible. That's neat. That's a discovery, right? And actually, one of my mentors at the University of Rochester, Earl Connie, who's written quite a bit with Feldman, has a paper called "Why Solve the Gettier Problem" that's worth taking a look at. It's collected in a volume of essays, I think, on philosophical analysis, but it might be a volume in honor of Ed Gettier. As far as I know, Gettier's still alive. He's retired. He's emeritus, and was at University of Massachusetts at Amherst for essentially all of his career. Kind of funny anecdotal story before we get back into looking at the problem. Apparently, this could be entirely apocryphal, so don't hold me to it. But the story I heard was that he was a young professor who was coming up for tenure, and he hadn't published enough. And if you might be aware of this, maybe not though, that essentially in order to get tenure you have to publish quite a bit in a certain amount of time, and there are requirements and journals and whatnot that are approved and all this sort of thing. And so Gettier went to his faculty mentor, so even when you've got your PhD and you're a professor, you still have a person above you and a person above that person, right? It keeps going. And talked with his mentor about what he was going. What am I going to do? I want to get tenure. I don't have these publications. He said, I've got 3 ideas. I've got 2 papers in the history of philosophy, and then this other paper on the justified true belief analysis of knowledge. And what do you think? And apparently, I don't know who this person's been shrouded in mystery, the mentor, told him that the 2 history papers looked promising and he should pursue those, but he's just wasting his time with that justified true belief stuff. So thankfully, he disregarded this advice, right? And as a result, we have really a model of just beautiful analytic philosophy, clarity, concise, 2.5 pages. I mean, you can hardly say anything, right, for many of us in 2.5 pages. So take a look at that essay. It's in the Sousa volume. That's kind of the big handbook that we're using for the second portion of the semester, and it won't take you long to read it. You'll notice after reading Feldman's exposition in our textbook, going back to Gettier, that it seems a lot harder. And that's because he's doing it for the first time, right? I mean, so his examples are in some ways overly complicated. You can come up with real sort of pared down versions that make the point, especially for folks who are struggling to get it, to see it at all. So in my intro classes, I use a real simple version of a Gettier kind of case. And I'll share that with you too in just a little bit here. So take a look at that when you get a chance. Questions from you guys, again, before we get started? All right, cool. So last time we had gotten as far as kind of laying out the different conditions, and what I kind of like to do is not just sort of, here's the analysis, let's go to town, evaluating it, but try to motivate each of these conditions, right? I mean, so one thing that's worth pointing out about the traditional approach is, I'll try to draw circles without screeching the chalk, because everybody goes crazy when they hear that, right? So is that the traditional approach to analyzing knowledge makes knowledge a species of belief, right? It turns out to be a species of belief, and that in itself is interesting. So imagine that this is like the set of all truths. And you'll have to pardon my handwriting. I'm left-handed, and it's terrible. So if you can't read my chicken scratch, just tell me and I'll fix it. So this is the set of all truths. Let this be the set of all of the beliefs, the true beliefs, right? In here, you got the truths. You've got the truths that you have a belief about, right? Then you're going to have the truths that you have a belief about that are justified. And then finally we'll see right here. I'll make it really little just for dramatic effect. That's knowledge. That's how much we know. No, just kidding. According to the standard view and Feldman's approach, we know all this wonderful stuff, right? And we do. It's good. So this is the stuff we know. Knowledge, or the known. And I think this kind of way of looking at it, it's a nice picture, because you can kind of see how things kind of get embedded, right? But it does turn out that knowledge is a species of belief. It's a kind of believing, right? So on the original proposal, we've got it. We put it up here in front of us. We got through the first condition. I'm going in a different order, I think, than Feldman does. I think he starts with a belief condition, but let me see if I can. How's the focus on this looking, guys? Is it all right? I want to blow it up a little bit, but I'm not sure how to make it bigger. Good? Focus is all right? Okay, cool. Nothing's more annoying than like you're sitting through a thing and it's like all blurry and nobody knows. And it's terrible. So in any case, we got the first condition, right? And hopefully, if you have questions, by all means, I'm happy to try to answer them or take on any challenges. We could do a sort of show of hands how many people are convinced by the truth condition. Okay, all right, go on to the next condition, right? Sometimes, though, I have noticed in presenting this stuff with other level students that people are sometimes not sure why the truth condition holds or why it has to be there, right? People will say stuff like, oh, you can know something that's false. I know that it's false that there's a purple elephant in the room right now. I know that. That's not true. But we got to realize what's true is the negation. They're kind of getting mixed up in their own mind about the way negation works. So there can be true assertions that are affirmative, right? And there can be true assertions that are negative. And that's just the truth table for negation. So hopefully, after reflecting on it a bit, it seems right to you that knowledge has to be directed at whatever's true. Can't correctly be said to know something that's false. Thoughts on that? On truth for anybody? Okay. And I'm going to come back in just a second because Feldman, while he's at it, points out some stuff about his understanding of truth, the way he's thinking about it. And I'm thinking about it the same way as kind of in the very second meeting, we talked about the objective theory of truth. I just renamed the correspondence principle, right? In the literature on theories of truth, it always goes under the label correspondence theory of truth. And I just co-opted this other label, OTT, as a handy kind of way of pointing out to people some important features of this way of thinking about truth. So we got the truth condition, but there's counterexamples to thinking that this is enough, right? If we had, the initial proposal would be S knows that P at time T if and only if P is true at T. And what's the problem with that? You guys help me out now. What's the problem with just stopping with the truth condition and saying, hey, we're done? I mean,
I don't know, I'm just trying to say, it's like,
yeah.
to know something, you have to think it's the way things
I
are.
mean, knowledge is a state of mind, right? And truth is an external feature. Truth is external. So if we're trying to analyze knowledge, and knowledge, I mean, it's hard to say for sure. I try to tackle some of this in my dissertation, but what exactly knowledge is, it looks like it's a relational feature, right? It's a relation, like a property, but in this case, a relational one, between a person who's the knower and a proposition, right, at a time, and maybe even a mode of presentation, a manner in which the proposition is presented. Because you can recognize something as true under one description sometimes and not under another, right? I mean, you might recognize the person in the cubicle next to you as Clark, but not recognize him as Superman because you fail to know the identity. So there's some stuff about belief opacity and quantifying into these kind of so-called opaque contexts that can get you into trouble as well. In any case, what we want to ask here to see why we have to go to another condition, if you're not already like, well, it's obvious. I mean, we're trying to analyze knowledge. Knowledge is a mental state whenever it's present, and this is just talking about truth. It's not, we don't have the mental state into the picture yet. We got to get it in there, right? But you can also do it this way, and I like to think about things in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. It's my upbringing. I guess too many years in Rochester with Feldman and people like him. So you ask yourself, does the conditional go each way? Is it in general true that if S knows that P, then P has to be true, and then you go in the reverse direction, right? Is it the case that whenever P is true, S knows it? And so it goes the first way, but not the second, right? Shows that truth is a necessary condition for knowledge, but it's not a sufficient condition. In other words, it's entirely possible, and I think it happens all the time, that there are all kinds of statements that are true, but they're not known by anyone to be true, right? That's one way of explaining or accounting for discoveries, right? We make a scientific discovery. Well, presumably, water was H2O all along, and that had to be discovered. So it was true. Nobody knew that it was true until the advent of chemistry, of hydrogen chemistry. So we got to get another condition, and of course we know that's the belief condition, and this is kind of where we were last time, right? We'd gotten into this a little bit. And so the analysis at this point would be S knows that P, if and only if P is true, and S believes that P is true, right? And we'd be done. And we have to do the same thing, because what we're looking for is we want the analyzans, right? We want the right-hand side of the biconditional, of the if and only if. We want that to be necessary and sufficient for the presence of knowledge, right? That means that each of those conditions has to be individually necessary, logically necessary, and they have to be jointly sufficient. So taken all together as a package, whenever you've got that, you've got knowledge. And this is where I think we were talking a little bit about this idea of a true opinion and an account. What's the counterexample to this? Yeah, you can just come up with one, right? So I'll pull this down here. How far down do I have to go? So we got a couple of examples here. Slide us down before I do. So we talked about this a little bit last time, right? The idea that you can have a lucky guess. And I said one thing we want to, whatever else we want to say about knowledge and what it is, it shouldn't be fluky, right? I mean, it shouldn't be coincidental. It shouldn't be something that's just a happy accident or lucky, because many of us have the intuition that knowledge has to be firmer than that, has to be more stable than that. Plato has this beautiful sort of image of it being tethered, right? This idea of it somehow being grounded and not just something that's a coincidence. So the lucky guess example would do that. You're guessing, you form, and as I said, I have trouble believing my own guesses, I guess because I know the guesses. But if you could get yourself in that situation, then presumably you'd have a true belief, but nobody thinks that lucky guessing counts as knowing, right? So that seems to be a counterexample right there. And so then that leads us finally then, right, to the third condition. And let me see where I have that. Well, before I go to that, let me show you this stuff on truth too. I'll put it up and then we can So the traditional analysis, then we get this, right? S knows that P at time T, if and only if P is true. S believes that P is true, and S is justified in believing that P is true. And of course, a lot of the action in late 20th century epistemology in the post-Gettier era centers on trying to analyze the third condition, right? Trying to figure out what, well, a couple things. I mean, it centers on trying to solve the Gettier problem, which I'll go ahead and, spoiler alert, it's an unsolved problem. It's still out there. There are a whole bunch of different proposals. I think many graduate students' dissertations were sacrificed on the pyre of trying to solve the Gettier problem, only to realize, you know, a couple of days after defending their dissertation, or right before defending, you know, that somebody's got a counterexample to your proposed fix to the Gettier problem. So it's out there. It's still a real thing. Feldman considers a couple of approaches, and we'll get to them eventually. So we've got the JTB analysis here. Before we talk about the Gettier counterexamples and how they work and see how people are doing with them, let me push this down a little bit so we can talk about truth, because some of the discussion posts made mention of some of these ideas about truth, and I want to give you guys a chance to talk about this stuff. So this is essentially the correspondence theory, right? That a proposition's true if and only if it corresponds with the facts, i.e. the way the world is. If it doesn't correspond with the facts, then the proposition's false. And so down below here, these are just me going through the stuff I've asked you to read in Feldman, pulling stuff out to have to project so we can talk about it. Some of the different implications of the correspondence theory. So the first one here, right, belief in propositions versus sentences. Do I need to say anything about that for folks? Because I can't assume that everybody has had a bunch of philosophy of language and, you know, is really comfortable with the difference between a statement and a sentence, or a proposition and a sentence.
Well, the book kind of explains that, the George Washington example.
Yeah.
I think they used that one person speaks French but no English, and the other person
There you go.
speaks English but no French. And they both take a U.S. history class, and they both understand the proposition that George Washington was the first president.
Right.
But if they meet up and try to say that to each other, the sentences are going to be different, but
The proposition's the same. Yeah, good, Alan. Thanks. So the way I've sort of always, and of course there's a lot of debate within philosophy of language circles, and I suppose in maybe even in metaphysics as well to some extent, over the exact nature of propositions. It gets, as you might imagine, pretty murky pretty fast. People have different views of what propositions are, in the same way that people have different views about possible worlds. So you've probably at some point in your career here encountered people talking about various using possible worlds, right? There's a possible world where this is true, or something true at a possible world. That's an entire area as well. And I guess within, again, philosophy of language and metaphysics and ontology. So I don't want to have to take a stand on it. Feldman certainly doesn't take a stand on what exactly the exact nature of propositions is. I know that people like Professors Hoffman and Rosenkranz, who some of you have had. How many have had had either of them face to face? Okay, good. They've talked about some of this stuff a little bit, right? And they take the view that propositions are abstract objects. They fall on the abstract side of the abstract concrete, distinction, much like numbers or sets or functions or universals, right? All these things would be abstracta as well, which is to say that, this is the short version, that they're not located in space, roughly. They're not spatial things. And in some cases, maybe that they can have multiple instances, like properties and relations can be multiply exemplified, right? So I think of a proposition as essentially, trying to adjust my microphone here. A proposition, no, it's too tight now. I'm getting strangled. Think of a proposition as essentially, and I use the word statement just so there's no confusion, interchangeably with proposition for our purposes. I think of it as essentially the content that the sentence expresses. And Alan's, Alan's description there of Feldman's example works. So multiple speakers from different natural language communities can, and there's some hand waving here, right? Because we all know that there's probably not going to be a concept in each natural language that has a target concept and for translation purposes in some other natural language, right? Apparently, Eskimos have however many different concepts of snow. I just have, a few concepts of snow, not too many, because I'm not surrounded by it all the time. I don't need it, right? It's not serviceable for me. So, and these are the problems you run into when you try to do translation, obviously, right? If you can't find a concept that smoothly maps on to the concept you're trying to translate, then you have to do something different. So, in any case, other features of the theory that are just worth pointing out in terms of things to know about truth or to be aware of that you may or may not agree with, and so I'm happy to hear what you have to say about it. First, the correspondence theory, according the way it's being understood here, is it's not mind dependent. It's an objectivist approach to truth, right? And as upper level philosophy majors, you've probably already been completely convinced of all of this, right? So no worries there, perhaps. But some of you might have different thoughts, I don't know, about the mind independence, right, of some of these features, and whether that's plausible or not. All we're saying here is that whether or not a statement is true or false doesn't depend on anybody's thoughts or feelings. What anybody thinks or feels about the statement depends on the facts in the world. So I'm sort of thinking about things as the world's fixed in various respects. It's fixed by physical laws, it's fixed by laws of logic, it's fixed by the legal norms that are in force, right? It's fixed by various social, political, economic, a whole range of different respects that I think of as kind of fixed respects, in the sense that they don't depend for their existence on the presence of any one particular mind, certainly. Some of these socially constructed facts, that's kind of a hot area, right? So thinking about like the laws that we have, for example, those look, obviously there have to be some people around to enact these laws, but I think the point is just that once we've got a legal fact, just to use that phrase, right, in place, it's certainly not up to any one person, and whether it is a legal fact or not doesn't depend on what anyone thinks or feels. Once it's been passed by the General Assembly or whatever, that's the law, right? So that's how I'm thinking about it. Thoughts, feelings? Good. It's Wednesday afternoon. Everybody's tired. It's sleepy time. All right. So it's not relative. There's no such thing on this kind of view as true for me, true for you. People talk that way in everyday life, right? They'll say, it's true for Bill that abortion's always wrong, but it's not true for Sally. And you can kind of see why people are inclined to maybe want to talk that way. I mean, I think some of it has to do with smoothing over what they are anticipating to be disagreement, right? It's kind of like saying, let's just agree to disagree. We can all be right, let's hold hands and skip away, whatever. It doesn't really seem to work though, right? I mean, according to this kind of approach to truth, there's the locution true for it's not defined, right? And Feldman's suggestion, and I think this is right, is just any case where you think you've got something that's an example of a thing that's true for one person and not true for another, it seems like you can just substitute belief for true for, right? So, yeah.
Well, because I was trying to parse through that on my own, that's kind of something that made me question it, because the other part saying, it's consistent with change, consistent.
Yeah. That was why I wanted to talk about this, because I know it was in one of the discussions.
Yeah, an example that comes to mind is like, it might be true for me that doing one push-up is more difficult than doing a push-up for someone else. So, and that doesn't imply that there's not like a concrete reality under it, but I'm just trying to figure out how that like plays into this.
Oh, good. Yeah,
It
thanks,
seems like
Tyler.
it's true for someone. Like, it's true for me that running a mile is going to be harder than running.
That would be contained in that individual proposition, though.
Okay, so it's about the proposition, not about.
Right.
Yeah, well, say more then, Zach. I wanted to make sure, because I'd rather hear you guys talk about this stuff than me.
For me, Zach, one push-up will make me stronger. And then for Tyler, it might be, for you, Tyler, it will require 2 push-ups.
Now, wait a minute now.
But that's like,
No body shaming.
No, I follow, I completely understand.
Sorry, I started out
Just
low,
kidding.
so
Yeah, just kidding.
It's like, I can't do a half push-up.
We gotta have a little fun with
See
this,
what I'm
right?
saying? Like, it's like they're different propositions. It's not saying that like only one push-up works for everyone. It's like, or you Tyler
So-
one push-up.
So, I mean, what we have to do, and this is, I'm glad you guys are bringing this up, and I don't want to just race off into other stuff when we've got these kind of questions. It's really important that we get clear on the statement that's at issue, right? I mean, we need we need to pin that down first. And you know this from all the courses you've taken already in philosophy, big courses with lots of people that aren't philosophy majors. A lot of time is often spent with people thinking that they're disagreeing or thinking that they've got an objection to a view, only to find out that nobody ever bothered to try to write the statement or the proposition that we're talking about down. So is the statement, one push-up is really hard to do? Or is this,
I'm trying to think of a better example.
or yeah.
But like,
Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
I think about location when I think of this. So let's say that two people on the phone, I think this was in the book as well. Let's say someone in Florida is
Right.
speaking to someone in Maine, and it's snowing in Maine, but it's not snowing in Florida.
Right.
So they start talking about the snow. The person in Maine is like, oh, it's snowing.
And the other person's like, it's not the case that it's snowing.
It's not snowing.
Yeah.
So it's true for the person in Maine that it is snowing because they can just look outside and see
Right.
it's snowing, you know,
Yeah.
setting aside all the skeptic arguments.
Right.
About there hallucinating or something. And then in Florida, it's true for them that it's not snowing.
But see, you're still using the phrase true for, right? We can get away from that, I think.
it seems like the way you like
It's true
put
that
the
it's
word.
snowing in Maine.
Yeah. So there's
Yeah.
some,
That is in the.
you got to build that into the proposition.
So pretty
Yeah.
much it's saying that anytime it seems like it's true for me, you could actually boil it down to being just a separate thing altogether.
Yeah, it may not work for every single case, but and Feldman points out that there's a good bit of literature on how to deal with these kind of cases. But certainly it might be that it looks like there's a single statement. It's snowing that they're disagreeing over, but there's probably some sort of implicit reference class or something, right? In the case of places, times. Yeah, Dominic.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so parents was raised that this is true for me, but not for somebody else.
Yeah.
If you were to put yourself in somebody else's exact circumstances, the truth would still hold in what's
Okay.
giving it.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, like there might be some like differences, but like the one push-up being hard for you, like anybody that was under the same circumstances that you're under, that truth would still hold no matter what. That's not really about to the fact of the one push-up being hard, it's the circumstances that you find yourself betrayed by.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, but good. Yeah. So, I mean, and of course, in the case of like one push-up is hard, just to stick with that example, I mean, when you say one push-up is hard, and then when Zach says one push-up is hard, I think it's tempting or plausible to think that there's really two different statements being asserted there, because probably it's hard for me, hard for you, hard for whoever the speaker is, right? So there might be some indexical reference there, like an I, like, it's hard for me, Tyler, but it's not as hard for me, Zach. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that helps a little bit. For the record, one push-up is hard for me too.
No, that didn't clarify. The other
you know.
example I was thinking was like, it's true for me that my blood is this type, and it's
Yeah.
true for you to that. But it's not the case, because if you were that person, it wouldn't be true for you. It just would be.
Well, this is back to yeah.
So it wasn't as confusing as I thought it was. As I thought it was.
Well, good. So the correspondence theory doesn't legitimize dogmatism or intolerance. This is a point I try to make a lot when this comes up in classes, because I think a lot of people, not so much this group, because my audience here are other philosophy people. You've had a lot of courses in philosophy, but for a lot of people, this idea that, look, I mean, truth is a kind of objective word-world relationship. It's a relationship of correspondence between things we call propositions on the one hand and facts or actual states of affairs on the other, right? And it doesn't depend, the truth that is, doesn't depend on our thoughts or feelings or, whether it would be convenient or inconvenient for it to be true or not. A lot of people take from that, well, this seems like a kind of authoritarian, sort of approach to truth that, who and you get the old, who's to say what the truth of the matter is, right? The who's to say type argument. And it doesn't follow, right? I mean, that it's consistent with the correspondence theory and with an objective approach to truth that there be reasonable disagreements. All that follows is that if there's a single statement that the two sides are disagreeing over, and they're meaning the same things by their words, then somebody's mistaken, right? It's like my cup on the table example that I've used forever and a day. You know, if I say the cup is on the table and Bettina says, no, it's not the case that the cup is on the table. Nobody talks that way in real life, right? It is not the case that. Commander Data and Spock maybe and some logicians. But in any case, that'd be and we're clear that we're disagreeing about, you know, this single statement, then one of us is right and one of us is wrong is an implication of the view. I had a student the other day email me a link to a YouTube video where some physics person was, you know, pointing out that, well, nothing's ever really on anything because nothing can ever touch anything else because of these various repulsive forces, right? Interesting stuff to think about. So kind of missed the point of my example, but fun nevertheless, right? To think about how you would try to form a coherent picture of the macro level and the small scale, given ordinary language and all the ambiguities and vagueness and whatnot involved. So the next thing here is that the correspondence theory is consistent with change, right? And we want that. This is something I think you were worried about again too, right? How can truth be objective and yet there be things changing? What was?
I mean, it just seems like if something changes, it just means that whatever the truth statement is
Has changed?
Just be different, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, keep in mind that we can also deploy a similar kind of strategy, right? Like with these sort of built-in implicit reference classes and things like that. We could say the same thing about just time indexing the propositions. So you might think of each proposition as sort of having an implied reference to a time. So the cup is on the table now. That proposition is the one talking about that moment. And it's not on the table now. Well, this is a new proposition.
It does seem
Right.
something relativistic about that, though. And like implicitly.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, if it's relative to the time index, then it's all in the same way that you're saying like knowledge is like a relation between like you knowing something and the state of the thing.
Mhm.
Not to say that it's all relative, but it's like
Yeah.
I don't know how to characterize that or what that means.
Yeah. I mean, you could have. I mean, there's different approaches to propositions and how you want to think about them. But I mean, it just seems to me like, you know, right now it's true that the statement I'm sitting is true. The statement that I'm sitting is no longer true, but they're at two different times. So there's no single statement at a single time that's both true and not true at the same time. We don't want that. That'd be to violate our principle of, you know, non-contradiction. So whatever you think of the law of excluded middle, we don't want contradictions rearing their ugly heads. So, but yeah, I mean, it seems to go without saying that you want your theory of truth to be compatible with change, because change seems ubiquitous and undeniable, and things are changing all the time, you know. Next here, we've got what consistent with a variety of value theories. Need not imply skepticism. I guess he felt compelled to put that in there. Just a little shout out to Alan and the friends of the skeptics, right? I mean, it need not imply skepticism. But I got to be honest with you, from years of presenting, you know, thinking about truth and doing it mostly with interest students, they have a hard time distinguishing what the correspondence theory is intended to be a theory of from another question, which is how can I tell what's true? So I present the correspondence theory and say, look, a statement's true if it corresponds to the facts. And they say, yeah, but how can you know the facts? Or what are the facts? Or how can I tell whether a statement's true? To which I usually just respond by saying, well, look, it's not a theory of how you can tell what's true. You're asking for a theory of knowledge. That's what we're going to eventually get to. That's what we're doing in here, is trying to construct an account of what it is to know something, and then later to look into some of these other questions like, do we know anything? Or are the arguments of the skeptics so powerful that we, you know, the best we can do is just form beliefs, hope we get it right, or suspend judgment and try to avoid error, you know? So I can see why at first pass people might think, well, look, I mean, if truth is objective and we're stuck within inside our own heads, right? You got this kind of Cartesian picture of the world, you know, sort of representational kind of view, where the mind represents the world, but those representations can be closer to the truth or further from, can be mistaken, then yeah, you might think that this is a bad idea because this is paving the way for skepticism. And we want to avoid that at all cost. For my own part, I take skepticism seriously. I think it needs to be, at least in this context. We're going to have our meeting today, and it'll end, and I'm going to go out the door with the rest of you, and put on my regular guy, ordinary person hat, and live disregarding a lot of what Hume had to say. Right? I'm going to go on about my day as if, these past regularities will hold up in the future, and that the sun will rise tomorrow, and that there is a substantive self, and the cause and effect are real things. So it may be hard to live skepticism, but that's not an argument for thinking that it might not be the right view. Strictly speaking, it might not be justified. Having said that, I put myself with people like Feldman as someone who would like to think that after this project is complete, what we're doing in this course and looking at this literature, after that project's been completed, that we'll still end up knowing a bunch of stuff, and some important stuff too, right? That it won't be that we can't escape skepticism. Though I admit it's really, really hard. You'll see when we get there, when we start looking at some of these arguments from skeptics, and some of the papers that people have picked address that issue. So let's see, the next thing, correspondence theory and vagueness. Trying to remember what he was worried about there. Just that there might, obviously, I think of vagueness primarily as a linguistic phenomenon. So it's different than ambiguity, right? Anybody want to say what the difference is between ambiguity and vagueness? Because this is an important thing to know as part of your philosophical education. Yeah.
It seems like vagueness would be a lack of information, whereas ambiguity would be where the information could be interpreted in more than one way.
Okay, close. I'm just. So yeah, I think you're Tyler. Yeah, I think you're in there. Anybody want to say some more? Ambiguity and vagueness. These are linguistic phenomena first and foremost, right? Ambiguity is a word that has a word or a phrase or even a sentence that has more than one meaning, right? If ambiguity affects a sentence, it's called amphiboly. It's kind of a weird, good word to know. Amphibulous, like the sentence, "Bill likes football more than his wife." Get it? Is it Bill likes football more than his wife does, or Bill likes football more than he likes his wife? It's an amphibulous sentence. Yeah. What is it? Save water and waste paper. That's another one, right? You're supposed to save your water and your waste paper, rather than save the water and waste the paper. So, yeah.
There's another one like "Let's eat Grandpa."
Yeah. Let's eat. Right. Yeah. Let's eat Grandpa. Yeah. Nice. Always good to get a little.
What's the word for that?
Amphiboly. Yeah.
How does that
It's
spell? Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's funny. It's worth knowing. It's one of those weird things. Amphiboly. I think that's right. But yes, again, for me, this is my version of the capstone, and I'm always trying to figure out what level to pitch things at, and based on people's backgrounds and interests and whatnot. And I don't, every philosophy professor in this department has their own style and their own approach and does their thing. So I can't presume to know what everybody's already seen or heard. So if it's a rerun for you, I'm sorry, but it's good to know this. Ambiguity is a word, a phrase, a sentence is ambiguous if it has more than one meaning. So like the word bank. I went to the river bank. I went to the financial institution bank. And usually what we have to do is just disambiguate. If you come in a whole lot of 20th century analytic style philosophy is just that. It's a careful focus on language. The 20th century is often referred to in Anglo-American philosophy as the century of the philosophy of language. You have people like Russell and Whitehead and G.E. Moore and Wittgenstein and Carnap and Quine and all these people, the verificationists, the positivists, all really, really concerned to be as clear as possible in their language, so as to avoid, with the thought being, wouldn't it be nice? No, I'd be out of a job. But wouldn't it be nice if almost all these philosophical problems that have given us such a hard time for so long turn out just to be problems with language? because that's tractable. We can solve those kind of things. We can be, use the language as our wedge to get out, to extricate ourselves from these problems and maybe dissolve them. That's exactly what people like Ryle was doing, right? Gilbert Ryle with his famous critique of Descartes, showing that it's, the mind-body problem is a category mistake. It's just something we can dissolve away. So that's the ambiguity. Vagueness is a different kind of thing. Vagueness doesn't have to do with meaning. It has to do with there being no precise cutoffs, right? So if I say, Timmy is 6 feet 2 inches tall. And then that's all you know about Timmy. Is Timmy tall or not? 6'2". Is he tall? Well, that's what you want to know. That's the problem, right? Because notice that, you know what the word tall means. It's not like it's got another meaning. It might, but we're talking about height, right? About how tall something is. So we know all we need to know about the meaning of the word, but we might even know all that we could even stipulate that there's nothing more to know about the case. Let's just say he's just, that this guy, Timmy's 6 feet 2 inches tall. You guys got it. You're like, well, it depends. What are we talking about here? Well, if it's NBA basketball players, I don't know a lot about those guys, but I'm imagining 6'2" is not one of the taller people out there. That's, little on the lighter side for NBA players. But if it's a third grader, you got a really big kid. You've got to get to the endocrinologist right away, right? You've got some sort of glandular disorder or something, and that's, so makes a difference. The reference class. So in these cases, this is a famous old Sorites paradox. People might have seen that before or heard of it. It's an ancient paradox. Sorites. It's the paradox of the heap. The idea is, what a heap, like a heap of sand, a big pile of sand. So the idea, and this goes way back, is take a heap of sand and take one grain away from it. Do you still have a heap? Yeah, sure, because one grain intuitively can't make the difference between something's being a heap and something's not being a heap. It's just a single grain, right? So you iterate that principle and take another grain away. Is it still a heap? Yep, because it's like a giant mound of sand. Make it ice melt or rock salt, fitting to the environment out here, right? And you keep doing this, you see where it's going. Eventually you've taken away so many grains of sand one at a time that you're down to, 2 or 3 grains, and you take one away and you've just got 1 grain left. Well, clearly 1 grain of sand does not a heap make, right? And so the question is, at what point in this process of gradually removing grains of sand does it go from being a heap to not being a heap, right? Now I think one of the most popular sort of approaches to this is to say, well, look, it's one of these threshold concepts, one of these continuum concepts. You've got stuff that's clearly a heap, where the concept applies. You know for sure it's a heap. We've got the other end of the spectrum is something that's clearly not a heap, like a single grain of sand. And in a lot of the cases along the way, there's not going to be any trouble determining, right? 3 or 4 grains isn't a heap, 6 or 8 grains isn't a heap, 25 is not going to make a heap. And same with the heap that's diminishing as we go along. But eventually you're going to reach an invisible boundary. We call this the borderline case area, right? These are borderline cases where you can know all the facts of the matter that there are to know, and you still don't know whether the concept applies. And there's different suggestions about why this is the case. Why does this happen? A lot of folks in the early part of the 20th century that were enamored with philosophy of language really liked the idea, like Russell, of constructing a logically perfect language, where every single entity had a proper name associated with it, and you didn't have more than 1 Rick or 2 Bills or 5 Sallys, right? Everything was logically perfect, and also in an attempt to avoid this kind of problem of vagueness, right? Knowing whether or not concepts apply, eliminate these kind of cases. I think one popular approach is to say, it's a linguistic phenomenon, and we have to handle it that way. There are approaches to truth involving truth value gaps, where they'll just talk about certain statements, truth values being gappy. So there's a range where it's clearly true, and a range where it's clearly not true that the concept applies, and then there are going to be some gaps in there where we just don't know. interestingly enough, it might turn out that a whole lot of philosophical concepts that we actually care about are affected by both ambiguity and vagueness. So think about like the concept of a person, for example, right? I mean, there's different conceptions of what a person is. It has different meanings, so it looks arguably ambiguous. And it might even be that you can know all there is to know about a putative entity, like a fetus that's developing, or a person who's had a permanent brain injury that's left them in a permanent vegetative state or something. Know all there is to know and still not be able to answer the question of whether or not X is a person. I find that kind of tempting. Justification comes in degrees, another thing. This is important. Truth might not come in degrees, right? But justification looks like it sure does. Because you can be more or less justified in believing something based on the strength of your reasons, evidence, arguments, and so on. And you guys just stop me on any of these if you have questions. Justification doesn't imply belief. This is important since we're going to be doing some epistemology. The way and Alvin Goldman talks about this in one of his famous papers, and it's actually, and I think Hillary Kornblith does as well. So there's a couple different senses of justification here. The way I'm understanding the third condition on knowledge and the traditional analysis is, I mean, of course, we got the second condition, which already says that the person has the belief. But just to say that a person's, if I say Alan's justified in believing that it's snowing outside, what I'm doing is I'm evaluating Alan's doxastic alternatives vis-a-vis the evidence that he's got, the reasons he's got, the arguments that are available to him. Doesn't mean he'll go on and form the belief. I can say, Zach's justified in believing P, whatever P is, right? Doesn't mean he'll actually go on and form the belief. Just means that it would be proper for him to do so. It would be appropriate. He would be within his epistemic rights, so to speak. Right? He has the right to form that belief. If you want to think about it in kind of deontological terms, you can do that. So there's being justified in believing something. That's an evaluative epistemic status, a positive epistemic status. And then there's a sense in which we say, S is justified in believing something that's meant to suggest, oh, and by the way, the person's gone on ahead and formed the belief as well. Feldman, not in this literature here, but in other places, has made that distinction, and he describes the one where you're justified in believing, and by the way, you went ahead and formed the belief as a belief's being well-founded, right? So it's a belief that's justified, and it's been formed on the basis of one's justification. Because here's one of the problems you can get into, right? You might be justified in believing something, have all the evidence in the world, let's say, for believing it. And it would be appropriate for you to go ahead and do so. But suppose you do it, but you don't do it on the basis of the justification that was available to you, right? So you're justified based on good reasons for thinking that it's raining outside right now. Let's suppose you see it or you hear it or you check your smartphone, get the weather forecast, whatever. And so it'd be justified for you to believe that. But suppose that instead of forming the belief on the basis of that good evidence that's available to you, you read the horoscope or you consult the witch doctor or read the tea leaves and form it on or get the magic 8-ball. You guys remember those? I got one of those that I use sometimes, a handy magic 8-ball reasoning. The beliefs formed on the basis of the deliverances of an 8-ball. You know what it is. Is it raining outside? It most certainly is. Something like that. Try again later is what I always get. But in any case, the way this is being understood, it's not. We can talk about a beliefs being justified, and that's positive epistemic status. That's something good. It's evaluative. But it doesn't automatically imply that the belief is present, that the person has a belief. Justification is agent relative. Anybody bothered by that or worried about it? Okay.
I'm not really sure what you're talking about there.
So because you're justified for believing something doesn't mean I'm justified for believing it. It's not like a set of evidence. Or you might know set of evidence that I don't know. So you can be justified for believing X, whereas I'm not experiencing that evidence, so I'm not be justified for believing X.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dom. Yeah, I appreciate you helping out here. I mean, so according to this kind of picture, right, each of us is accorded a certain body of evidence. And I've said, I'm thinking of it primarily as my experiences together with my other justified beliefs, right? And on that basis, that body of evidence then justifies me in believing certain other things. So you're considering some proposition or statement. It might be that your evidence, the body of evidence that you've got, makes believing that proposition the rationally correct thing for you to do, the right, epistemically right thing for you to do, whereas suppose Dominic isn't privy to any of that information, wouldn't be justified for him. There's no problem here, though, because notice that we're talking about justification, not truth. That's different, right? It's not like we're saying it's true for you, but it's not true for Dominic. We're just saying it's justified for you, but it doesn't automatically mean it's justified for him. And this has come back in a big way in the past maybe 5 or 10 years in epistemology. There's been a tremendous amount of interest in so-called reasonable disagreements and just disagreement generally. Like, what do you do? I mean, because disagreement is fascinating, right? It's fun to think about. I mean, most of us don't really, we try to avoid them maybe, unless you're that kind of philosopher, like doing the Socrates thing, right? Going around annoying people at coffee houses and showing them that they're wrong and don't know nearly as much as they think they do. But the idea that how should we respond to disagreement, right? What should we do when people seemingly well-intentioned, well-meaning, well-informed, right? Especially when experts disagree. That's really tough because one expert is an expert and they've got all the credentials and they say P is true, and then you get another expert and they've got all the credentials and it's supposed to be just as good and they say no, P isn't true. Well, now we got a problem, right? I mean, you might think, well, in that case, all you can do is search for more experts or suspend judgment and await additional information, additional evidence. The last thing here, distinguish being justified from showing that one is justified. And that's important too. I can think about that for a second, but there's whether or not you're justified on the basis of, let's just say, reasons, arguments, evidence, because we haven't really talked about evidentialism, Feldman and Connie's theory per se, but we will in some detail. There's the status of being epistemically justified in believing a proposition, and then there's this different thing, which is being able to show that you're justified, that you in fact have that epistemic status. And these are different things. I mean, a person might be justified, but then when it comes time to try to provide the demonstration of that, they mess it up, or they end up kind of derailing. They have evidence that's perfectly good available, but they fail to make use of it. This sort of stuff happens in real life. So good. I wanted to make sure I had a chance to see if people had questions about this stuff. On to the next part then. So we've got the let me just put this back up. So we've got the traditional analysis here, right? JTB, and we want to talk a little bit about whether or not this is correct. So you've read the stuff, and a lot of people, and in one of the previous discussion questions, I asked people to try to answer the question before going any further in, right, to see if anybody would automatically reject the traditional analysis before finding out about the Gettier problem. Now that you've read about the Gettier problem, of course, everybody's, well, yeah, the traditional, it's no good. We got to reject it. But it seemed like a lot of people liked it in the discussion posts that I was reading. I mean,
Alan and I had problems with it.
I
think the example I gave was the Earth being flat, and Alan gave the example of the Earth being a center universe.
Yeah.
And the
What?
example we gave, they're both clearly false.
Yeah.
But,
So what's the, explain the problem that you're having with it, because I want to talk about it.
I would probably explain better than I am. He's the bigger skeptic. But I have the intuition, and I knew Alan would explain it better. So.
Well, yeah, Alan, take over. Yeah.
All right, well,
Help us out here.
I saw this tag.
Yeah.
Basically, the statements, P is true, S believes that P is true, and S is justified. Well, that justified belief is just that, a belief.
Mhm.
So people were justified in believing that the world was at the center of the universe.
Right.
We can't observe the Earth moving. We don't feel any air currents. We're not thrown off the planet. When you look up at the sky, it seems like the sun is moving from one side of the sky to the other.
Right.
And so they had evidence that was enough justification for them to
Sure. Yeah, but we don't have a counterexample yet to TAK, right? Because the truth condition is not satisfied.
Yeah. Yeah, that
So-
was
so, but-
my
but-
whole problem,
so-
like,
so-
how do you even get to that?
Well, that's
How
what.
do you even get to this is true?
Oh, okay. So you're. I'm putting words in your mouth here, but this is what the fun part of doing this kind of seminar type philosophy is. So is your worry that the most we can ever hope, the best we can do is just form beliefs about things, and there might be canons that tell us which ways are the better ways to form beliefs, like follow your evidence, pay attention to experts, don't consult the horoscope or the tea leaves or whatever. But at the end of the day, all you've got is just a bunch of beliefs that might be more or less justified, but you're never going to be in a position to lay claim to the truth. Is that the worry? Because truth is external. I mean, on the traditional, notice that, and this is something I should have said earlier, but notice what we've got here. We've got a truth condition, a belief condition, and a justification condition, right? The truth condition is external. All I mean by that is that it's not something you have immediate access to, right? I can't directly introspect whether or not a statement is true in general. I mean, maybe this is going to be problematic in cases involving introspective beliefs and things like that, so I want to set that aside. But in general, like if somebody says there's 12 people in the room next door, they make that claim, I can form a belief one way or the other about it, and I may or may not have adequate reasons to back up my belief, but I can't just willy-nilly know whether it's true or not. That's a fact determined by the number of people in the room, right? So in that sense, truth is external, and I mean, I think, yeah, there are folks of a skeptical bent are worried that we don't. Our access to the truth is not nearly as clear cut as they would like it to be. I mean, yeah, Dominic.
Yeah, I was kind of out on this one, the whole thing about saying like, okay, it's true, is that, like, okay, yeah, it makes it knowledge, but how do you go from the truth to the knowledge? Because the example I gave with the world being flat
Yeah.
was, okay, so the justification for it being flat was like just observing the horizon and how you walk, you don't ever like hit like a major curve, so like, and everything you observe, pretty much points to the fact that, okay, we're on a flat plane.
Yeah.
So then
Yeah, it looks
believe-
flat.
So then, so you believe that it's
Right.
that way. And so if you go ahead and say, well, all of my evidence is saying that it's true, well, I believe it's true, then doesn't that kind of make it true? So like, but then the answer would be no, because it doesn't actually correspond with anything they actually are.
Yeah.
It actually is a sphere.
Right.
So it's like.
I'm just worried that we're confusing the question. I mean, you guys got to help me out here. We're
It's
confusing the question of.
fine if I
Can,
write something on the
no, not at all. Here, have some chalk here.
diagram in mind. I
Okay. Yeah, help us out.
I showed you this video in the intro class.
Okay.
About, I think it's called the Phaneron.
Okay.
How we observe.
You need an eraser, yeah, we'll grab it for you. So yeah, I mean, while you're doing that, I'm just going to say, there's this worry, I mean, there's not a worry, but a kind of confusion that happens sometimes, which is trying to determine whether or not we know something, and then whether or not we know that we know it, right? So some of these worries might be about, okay, here's an analysis of knowledge, what it is for knowledge to be present. That's a different thing than the question of, can we know that we know things, right? For the traditional analysis, all that's required is that these three elements be present. There be a truth, there be a belief in the truth, and there be justification for your believing that that's true. They're independent things.
To me, it seems like the truth always has to go last right before knowledge. It has to be like the third step you take. Because,
Well, because it is external.
yeah, because
Yeah.
the biggest problem I had with it was when I was reading it, it just intuitively seemed somewhat off because the whole satisfaction of it actually, like, one, P being true, like, okay, yeah, I can agree that P needs to be true.
Yeah.
But I guess my worry is slightly different than the Gayer problem because he actually satisfies it. Mine is, hey, you can believe it's true, you can be strongly justifying in, like, you thinking it's being true, but then the whole thing about it being true and the knowledge is like, they seem to be very parallel.
Well, and bear in mind that the truth condition, as I say, it's external. It's an independent condition, right? I mean, you can have all the justification in the world for believing something and turn out to be wrong.
Yeah.
That's, I take it, the point of one of one of the principles that the Gettier cases rely on, right? This idea of I think he calls it JF, the justified falsehood principle or whatever, that a person can be justified to the level of what would be required for knowledge in believing something, and yet the thing turned out to be false. If it turns out to be false, then it's definitely not knowledge. But then people, hearing that, they'll say, well, how can I ever tell whether or not something's true, given that I've got all this justification for believing it? That's a different question. I mean, we're just trying to analyze knowledge right now, first order knowledge. Where the second order question, the meta question, there is a principle in the history of this kind of discussion. Famous Scandinavian logician named Jaakko Hintikka was one of the pioneers of epistemic logic. Epistemic logic is basically modal logic, where instead of doing boxes and diamonds, necessity and possibility, you do K and B for knowing and believing. Just like deontic logic, if you've maybe Professor Zimmerman might have shown you some of that at some point if you've had him, some of the deontic logic stuff, or maybe Professor McConnell if you took any of his courses. But in any case, you take classical logic and you add some extra operators. And these operators work the same way that necessity and possibility do. So you can, given any one of these concepts, you can sort of define the other concepts. And Hintikka poses this question in one of his systems of logic. Is it true in general that if S knows that P, then S knows that S knows that P? That's called the KK thesis. And I think that thesis is false, that principle is false. I think you can know something without knowing that you know it. But, okay, so thanks, Alan. Yeah, so where are we at now?
Well, I got this from
stand over here.
video I showed you, the Vsauce video.
I'll get you in the frame here, too. See if this thing...
Frame.
There we go. Yeah, you're on the swivel. Cool.
Awesome. Basically, this is the actual world, what the facts are, the truth, and in some cases, knowledge is over here as well. And in order to get anything in the world, you have to process it in your mind. You have to get it into the mind somehow. But what is the connection there? There's some kind of barrier. In the video, they called it the phaneron. Mm-hmm. And it's that huge risk of being lost in translation.
Yeah.
Take the case of color blindness. Someone may not know that they're colorblind, so they're taught all their lives that this is red, and someone who's not colorblind will say, oh, this is red. There's no mistaken communication.
Right.
But if you can somehow get outside of their minds and perceive what really is this, there is only one shade, but to both of them it looks different.
It's like playing this algorithm case card.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and Descartes, of course, is a figure that comes to mind for this kind of thing, too, right? I mean, part of his program having to do with the external world, which, again, some of you have picked articles for presentation that are about this problem, so-called problem of the external world. It's sort of going from the inside to the outside, right? Given only the resources of my mind, my internal world, my thoughts and feelings, beliefs, desires, etc., given only those meager resources and logic, can I deductively infer truths about the external world, like that there's a cup on the table? And I think most epistemologists would say, no, you can't. Descartes failed in that attempt. I mean, I love Descartes. He's maybe my favorite philosopher, historical philosopher. But I think, at that point, he goes in one direction, I go in another direction. I embrace fallibilism. He's a Cartesian, so he has to have Cartesian certainty. Zach.
So we're kind of analyzing this theory, if it matches logically, and then we will place it into the real world and see if it works. So basically what I mean is, like, we're not moving from 1 to 2 to 3. We're taking all of them at once and see if it holds.
Yeah. We're asking if all three of these conditions are satisfied for a person.
So we're not moving. Okay, once one is established, then we move to 2.
No, it's
okay. So
yeah.
Maybe is there something going on with that?
I think that seems like what's going on with these guys is they're saying, look, the natural order of things well, unfortunately, it's probably get the belief first,
Yeah.
Then try to find some justifying reasons for it, since you want to hang on to whatever you've already, natively believed, and then hope that it's true. Right? I mean, I'm being a bit cynical here, but it's hard not to be if you're a philosophy person and then you get outside of the philosophy classroom and you see the kind of stuff that people do, and it's like, oh, geez, really? I mean, seriously, you believe that? I mean, it's almost like they got the belief first. Then if they're concerned with like evidence or reasons or rationality at all, then they're fishing around to try to it's backward, right? You'd like to think that you're guided by the evidence you've got. You're guided by the reasons, the arguments, and you're kind of the ideal to me is kind of come into it neutral. Look at the very best arguments you can on either side. Make up your mind then, and always be aware that it's far easier to be mistaken than it is to be right. And there are a lot of different ways, sort of only one way to be right, but there's tons of different ways you can get it wrong. And that's a humbling kind of realization. I think it's good. I think an attitude of humility in these kind of contexts would really serve us better. But so this has been helpful for me because I hadn't really talked with people about this much. But yeah, the ordering here is not, it's not meant to be a realistic thing. It's just, let's just imagine that all three of these conditions are satisfied. Is it the case that any time that's true, you've automatically got a case of knowledge? So yeah, that was good. Thanks for that, Zach and Alan and Dom. Let me just so here's the next batch of stuff that we're going to have to get through, and we will. It won't. So we've got these. Wonder if I should hide that for you. So we've got these different cases here, right? And rather than me just describe them, I was going to let you guys describe them, or even read them if you want. They're pretty short. So somebody want to share the 10 coins case with us? How does that go? And you can either read it directly or you can just describe it.
So basically, Smith, he's sitting there observing the boss say that, I couldn't remember the guy's name, Robinson or whoever was going to get the job.
Yeah.
And he saw Robinson put 10 coins in his pocket, so then he deduced that, okay, well, whoever's going to get the job has 10 coins in his pocket.
Right.
But it turns out that the boss misspoke.
Yeah.
And that Robinson actually got the job that somebody else did.
Yeah. Somebody's the boss's nephew or something, right?
Yeah. So then the
Yeah.
conclusion that whoever's getting the job with 10 coins in their pocket is false. So I guess what Daniel was getting at is, so it was true that the boss did say this,
Yeah.
and it was true that he saw him put the 10 coins in his pocket.
Yep.
He had justification for these beliefs because he heard it from the horse's mouth, so to say.
Yeah.
And he saw it was their knife that got the 10 coins in his pocket. And he believed all this because he had strong justification for it.
Yeah.
However, he still ended up at a false conclusion. So
Well, actually, this is why I'm wanting us to go through this kind of slowly, right? Notice that in the Gettier cases, the conclusions that are arrived at are true, right? Because it's got to be a case of justified true belief. So the person in the Gettier case they satisfy all three conditions. They have a justified true belief. So let the belief be the person who is going to get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. And it turns out coincidentally that the guy who's really going to get the job also has 10 coins in his pocket, but of course the hapless victim in the Gettier case doesn't know any of that, right? He forms the belief that the person who's going to get the job has 10 coins in his pocket on the basis of this evidence that he's got, which turns out to be misleading, right? So this is one of the crucial things to realize, and this is why it's fun to go slow through this stuff, because on more than one occasion in philosophy settings, even with people in epistemology, I'll hear people start to refer to something or describe something as a Gettier counterexample or a Gettier case, and I'm like, it can't be a Gettier case if all three of these conditions aren't satisfied. It's easy to get bollocksed up on it, right? Because I mean, you got to make sure that the target belief is true. You got to make sure that the person has the belief. You got to make sure that they're justified, right? And what's happening, I mean, we can diagnose it later, we will, but there's clearly a disconnect between the person's justification for believing and the fact in the world that makes it true. In these cases, the person's justification for believing is sort of based on one thing, and then they infer from that something that turns out to be true, but not for the reasons that their justification suggested, right? Yeah.
It seems like then they just wouldn't be justified. I mean, depending on how you're thinking of it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one of the initial responses, right? Is these cases don't work because one or the other, either the justification they're not justified enough, or the deduction principle, the closure principle, is no good. So we got the 10 coins case, the no got and have it case involving the cars, right? All these have become classic cases. What Feldman's doing in some of these is he's like simplifying and redescribing cases that got really big in the literature after Gettier. The initial response to the 63 article was people like Tyler's sort of suggesting, sort of blowing back on it and saying, well, wait, this can't be something, we got to find a way to save the traditional analysis. It became clear by 67 or 68 there was no way, because none of these ways of trying to rescue the traditional analysis looked like they were gonna work. And so then the consensus sort of shifted among epistemologists, and people were like, yeah, looks like the Gettier problems are real, it's the real deal. And what that shows is that there's a fourth condition for knowledge that nobody's been able to figure out. Bunch of different proposals, but no consensus about that. The sheep in the field case, we'll describe both of these again next time. And you've got access to all these notes on Canvas under modules. So take a look at that. Take a look at the new discussion board I just put out there. And next time we'll blast through all of Chapter 3. We can do that in one meeting. And you might, if you get a chance, you could even, I was going to see if we want to go into Chapter 4 yet or not. We've got an exam coming up. I'll have to look at the calendar. Is it next week, supposedly? And I think it's supposed to be chapters 1 through 4. So we'll see. I want to.
You said it was more like a paper, right?
Yeah, well, it's what it's going to be. The way I'm going to do the exams is I was going to do short essay exams. So like I'll give you maybe I'll give you 3 or 4 essay questions and ask you to pick some number. Like give you 4 and you answer 3, or give you 3 and you answer 2. And it's not designed to be like monstrous or anything. You'll have a week to do it or whatever from the time that I assign it, and you can just email it to me. So I've just got to come up with something, and then they'll be covering this stuff, the stuff we've talked about, and the readings, yeah, the readings as well.
And for the discussion 4, is that we're writing about Chapter 3, or are we writing about Chapter 4?
No, we're writing about Chapter 3.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called Discussion 4, but only because the very first discussion was the meet and greet. Yeah, alrighty. Well, I'll go ahead and sign us off here.